Welcome back to the Deep Dive. Today, we are going deep into the early French Middle Ages, and we're looking at a king whose entire identity seems like, well, a paradox.
A complete paradox.
We are talking about Louis VI of France, a monarch known with equal historical weight by two totally contradictory titles. First, you have the fighter, the batailleur.
And then you have the fat, le gros.
The fat fighter. It doesn't quite sound right, does it?
It doesn't, but that contradiction, that image of a warrior whose own body eventually slows him down, that is the perfect lens for understanding his legacy. He wasn't the king who won the biggest, flashiest battles.
No.
But he might be the king who made the Capetian dynasty actually matter. We're looking at his 29-year run, so from 1108 to 1137. And in that time, he takes this functionally irrelevant kingship.
A local affair, really.
Exactly, and he transforms it into the foundation of what would become the French state.
Okay, let's unpack that. Because our mission today is to get past those nicknames, as colorful as they are, and really figure out how he did it. How did Louis VI manage this, well, this monumental task of centralization?
It was monumental. He inherited a complete mess, a fragmented disaster.
And what he left behind, while still not a modern state by any means, was a monarchy that was functional, it was stable, and crucially, it was recognized as the supreme legal authority.
And to do that, it took relentless warfare. That's the fighter part. He was fighting constantly, both against these internal threats that were, bordering on total anarchy.
And against huge external rivals. We're talking about the Anglo-Norman.
That's the big one. And like with so many figures from this early medieval period, our picture of him is heavily, heavily colored by one main source.
Right, and we have to put that on the table right away. We're talking about the Vita Ludovici Grossi Regis.
The Life of King Louis the Fat. And it's written by his loyal advisor, his friend, the abbot of St. Denis, a man named Sugar.
That is vital context. If your biography is written by your best friend and, let's be honest, your spin doctor,
So, absolutely.
then you have to read it as a panegyric. It's a celebration. It's designed to make Louis look good, to justify everything he did.
Precisely. Sugar's account is not neutral history. It is propaganda for the Capetian project, full stop. But, and this is the important part, because Sugar was Louis's confidant, because he was there at court, often on campaign.
He had a front row seat.
He gives us these incredible details on the king's character, his constant activity, his decision-making. We have to read it critically, of course, but we absolutely cannot dismiss it.
So the key thesis we're exploring today is that Louis VI's real success was in redefining what it meant to be king. He wasn't just another powerful duke. He became the king who reinforced royal power by making the crown the essential protector of the people.
He did it by force. He had to become that ceaseless fighter. And crucially, he institutionalized that authority.
And that's the part that really lasts. He's the first Capetian king we know of who issued ordinances, these royal orders that were meant to apply to the whole kingdom, not just his little patch of land around Paris.
And that subtle shift from being a localized lord to a national legislator, that's a giant leap. That's the beginning of a state.
Okay, so let's start with the man himself. Louis was born, around 1081 in Paris?
That's right, son of Philip I and Bertha of Holland. And this places him right in the heart of a dynasty that was, to put it mildly, precarious.
The Capetian grip on power was loose.
Very loose. It was often challenged. It was almost entirely localized. The dynasty itself was still pretty new, and they were really struggling just to establish hereditary succession as a given, instead of something the great lords got to vote on every time a king died.
And what's fascinating about Louis, even as a kid, is how the source material, so sugar, really insists on his natural talent for the military life. It's almost like he's preordained to be this warrior king.
There's that wonderful line from Sugar, isn't there?
Yes, he writes it in his youth. Growing courage matured his spirit with youthful vigor, making him bored with hunting and the boyish games.
Right, the stuff other kids were doing.
With which others of his age used to enjoy themselves and forget the pursuit of arms. It's basically a statement of destiny. This kid was built for conflict.
It's just a really focused mind, a disposition for duty. And he gets knighted in 1098. By 1103, his father, Philip I, sees this in him and associates him directly with the government.
So he's getting on-the-job training.
Critical, practical experience. He's managing a turbulent realm long before he actually wears the crown. And this isn't some leisurely apprenticeship. This is active governance under pressure.
Which was absolutely essential, because his actual ascension to the throne in 1108 was anything but smooth. It's a perfect example of the challenges he'd face.
A total mess. Philip III dies. Louis becomes king on July 29th. And he tries to follow tradition, get himself coronated at Reims, which is the spiritual heart of the monarchy.
But you can't even get there.
He's physically blocked from reaching Reims, and it's because of his own family, his half-brother Philip, who's likely in cahoots with other powerful lords.
So he's forced to hold a coronation in Orleans, a much less prestigious location, on August 3rd. That's not just an inconvenience, that's a public sign of weakness.
A huge sign of weakness. And the drama doesn't even stop there. In the middle of the ceremony at Orleans, an envoy from the Archbishop of Reims shows up.
Seriously?
Yes, and publicly challenges the legitimacy of the whole thing. He claims the ritual isn't being performed correctly, that the anointing is invalid.
Wow. Talk about starting on the back foot.
It was a very public, very powerful challenge to his authority, or right out of the gate. It showed that powerful figures, both in the church and among the nobility, were ready to use any loophole they could find to deny him legitimacy.
And while he pushes through and the challenge is dismissed, the whole incident just underlines how unstable the Capetian inheritance really was.
Absolutely. His entire life would be about asserting his basic right to rule.
So let's get a clear picture of the kingdom he inherits. When you say France in 1108, what does that actually mean? Forget the map we know today.
You have to forget it completely. The Kingdom of France in 1108 was a geographical expression. It was not a centralized state. Louis's direct royal authority was incredibly limited.
It was basically just the Isle de France.
That's it. A small but crucial territory centered on Paris, Orléans, and Sens. Outside of that little strip of land, you have these massive figures like the Duke of Normandy, the Count of Anjou, the Duke of Aquitaine.
Count of Flanders?
All of whom exercised pretty much sovereign power in their own lands. In theory, Louis was their feudal superior.
In theory.
But in practice, they often treated him like a minor nuisance, not a legitimate ruler. And his goal, the mission that would define his entire reign, was to change that dynamic.
And the sources lay out these two huge simultaneous challenges that he had to overcome to do that.
Exactly. First, there's the external pressure. That means constantly fighting back against the rising power of the Anglo-Normans, led by the incredibly capable Henry VI of England.
Who controls both England and the massive continental territory of Normandy.
It's an existential geopolitical threat right on his doorstep.
And then there's the internal threat, which you could argue was even more dangerous to the day-to-day functioning of his kingdom.
It was immediate anarchy. The royal heartland, the Isle de France itself, was plagued by these petty, violent robber barons, these chatelaines.
Local lords who'd built up their own private fortresses and just acted with total impunity.
They completely undermined any concept of royal peace or justice. Louis couldn't dream of projecting power across France until he could guarantee a safe road from Paris to Orleans.
Which brings us back full circle to that contradiction. The fighter and the fat. It sounds like an insult, or maybe a story of great warrior who went soft. How do we reconcile them?
I think it tells the story of the sheer physical toll of medieval kingship. He starts his reign as le batailleur, the fierce warrior king that Sugar describes. He is constantly on campaign, leading his troops in person, embracing that military rigor he needed to subdue his vassals.
So he earns the title, the fighter, through his actions.
Absolutely. The gros part, the fat part, that comes later. Louis was known for a healthy appetite, a love of food and wine, and relentless stress. The years of campaigning and maybe just poor health management, it all caught up with him.
So it's a physical limitation.
Yes. Sugar explicitly says that by his 40s, his weight became so great that it was incredibly difficult for him to ride a horse, to wear armor, to lead from the front. He physically slowed down.
But the fighter title stuck.
It stuck because his policy never changed. It remained relentlessly aggressive, relentlessly military-focused, even when he had to delegate the frontline command. His fighting spirit never subsided, even when his body did.
So let's dive into that fight. We have to start with the internal cleanup job, because as you said, without a stable Ile de France, nothing else is possible. Taming these robber barons was basically his job description for the first couple of decades.
It was nation building, but disguised as a series of, local police actions. The problem was that these lords, these chatelaines, weren't just rebellious. They were actively parasitic.
What does that mean in practice? What were they actually doing?
Well, they openly resisted the king's authority. Some minted their own coins. They all engaged in systematic brigandry that just paralyzed the local economy.
It's organized crime, essentially.
On a feudal scale, yes. from their powerful castle places with names you see again and again, like Le Puisset, Châteaufort, Montméry. They would set up illegal tolls on key trade routes. They'd waylay merchants, rob pilgrims.
And terrorize the local population.
Absolutely. The chronicles were full of stories of them terrorizing the peasantry. And critically, for the historical record, they frequently looted church property. Churches, monasteries, abbeys.
And since the men writing the history were almost all clerics.
That guaranteed these barons a reputation for pure evil, which in turn gave Louis the perfect justification for his extreme interventions. He wasn't just a king grabbing land, he was a righteous king restoring God's peace.
So he spent the first years of his reign in constant motion. He's acting as the supreme judge, jury, and executioner.
That constant motion is the very definition of le batailleur. In 1108, the year he's crowned, he's already besieging La Ferté-Alais. He's fighting a lord named Hugh of Crécy, who had kidnapped the Count of Corbeil.
So this is about enforcing basic feudal order.
Yes, maintaining the social hierarchy. It's not about conquest, it's about justice.
And the sources show he's projecting this power surprisingly far, almost immediately. He gets involved down in Bourbon.
That Bourbon intervention, also in 1108, is so important. It shows the expanding reach of his authority. You have a local lord, Aymon Vervache, who had basically stolen the lordship of Bourbon from his young nephew.
And the family of the wronged heir appeals to the king.
They do. And Louis, acting as the ultimate arbiter, demands Aymon give it back. Aymon refuses. So Louis marches an army, which is a huge logistical effort. It's a long way from Paris, and he besieges the castle of Germany-l'Exempt. He forces Aymon to surrender and restores the rightful heir.
That sends a message.
It sends a massive message across France. The king, even if he's far away, is the ultimate source of feudal justice, and he has the military power to back it up.
But it's not just strangers. Even his own family were part of the problem.
Yeah.
You mentioned his half-brother, Philip.
Yes, in 1109, Louis is forced to besiege Mantes-la-Jolie to deal with him. And Philip was frequently allied with this other major thorn in Louis's side, Amaury III de Montfort.
And the Montforts were a serious problem.
Their power was immense. They controlled a whole string of castles that formed this continuous barrier south of Paris. You have to imagine it like a roadblock just choking the main routes connecting the king's major cities. Louis had to spend a huge amount of time and resources just neutralizing his own relatives and their disruptive friends.
But his campaign wasn't just smashing castles. He was also taking steps towards actual governance. You mentioned the Marchand de l'Eau in 1121. That seems like a different kind of move.
It's a huge step. This is where you see the shift from just fighting anarchy to building a state. The Marchand de l'Eau, the merchants of the water, were a guild he established to regulate trade on the River Seine.
Why is that so revolutionary?
Well, first, it shows he recognizes the growing economic importance of Paris and its river trade. But second, this is the king asserting royal jurisdiction over commerce. He's setting the rules, providing standards, and presumably collecting revenue.
He's building an institution.
An institution that would eventually evolve into the municipal government of Paris. It proves Louis understood that being a king wasn't just about fighting, it was about structuring the economy and the law.
Let's talk about some of the specific bad guys because the sources are so vivid. To really understand the need for Louis's ruthlessness, you have to look at someone like Thomas, Lord of Coucy.
Thomas of Coucy was on another level. He wasn't just a robber, he was a sadist. The contemporary writers are just horrified by him.
And they record some truly gruesome details about his methods of torture.
They do. The accounts mention him hanging men by their testicles, cutting out eyes, and chopping off feet. This is the kind of person Louis had to deal with to prove he was worthy of the name king.
It paints a picture where the king's intervention is necessary for basic human safety.
It is. The chronicler Guibert of Nogent wrote, "No one can imagine the number of those who perish in his dungeons, from starvation, from torture, from filth." When Louis waged war on a man like that, everyone, the clergy, the peasants, saw it as righteous and necessary.
He was fulfilling his sacred duty to protect the weak.
Exactly. But if Thomas of Coucy was the monster, then Hugh, Lord of Le Puisset, was the cockroach. He was just defined by his sheer infuriating persistence.
This is the guy Louis had to fight 3 times, right?
Yeah. 3 times. Hugh of Le Puisset is the perfect example of Capetian frustration. So, in 1111, Louis gathers charges against him for brigandry near Chartres. Even other big lords like Theobald of Champagne are complaining about him.
Louis summons him to court, and Hugh just ignores him.
Blows him off completely, so Louis moves fast. He strips Hugh of his titles, besieges his castle at Le Puisset, captures it, and for dramatic effect, burns it to the ground.
Okay, so problem solved.
You'd think so. He captures Hugh. But then, in a moment that Sugar describes as rash, Louis lets him go. He trusts Hugh's oath to be good.
Big mistake.
Huge. Louis gets distracted by his bigger problems with Henry II of England, and Hugh, with breathtaking cynicism, immediately breaks his oath, rebuilds his forces, and goes right back to terrorizing the countryside.
And he even gets help from Theobald of Champagne, the guy who complained about him in the first place.
It just shows you the shifting loyalties. It was a total free-for-all. So Louis has to do the whole thing all over again. He comes back, he besieges Le Preset a second time, and he raises it again.
And Hugh swears another oath.
And incredibly, for a third time, he rebuilds the castle and goes back to his old ways. Louis has to come back for a final, definitive campaign, crush him completely, and strip him of his lands forever.
It's just exhausting to even hear about. The sources say Louis was in constant motion against them.
Yeah.
What was the ultimate significance of all this grinding, repetitive domestic fighting?
The cumulative effect was transformative. First, it established a powerful precedent. The king is not just some symbolic figure. He is an active force who will use violence to enforce his justice, no matter how powerful or remote you are.
And second?
Second, and maybe more importantly, it fundamentally changed the king's relationship with the rest of French society.
How so?
By being the guy who protected people from monsters like Coucy and persistent threats like Le Puiset, Louis earned the active support of the groups who desperately needed stability. The merchants who needed safe roads, the clergy who needed their lands protected, and the peasantry who just needed to not be murdered.
He made the monarchy indispensable.
He elevated the Capetian monarchy from just another regional lordship into a necessary, vital institution, the only effective source of law and order in the entire realm.
Okay, so he spent a decade, maybe more, cleaning up his own backyard.
Right.
But now he has to turn his attention to the massive, consolidated threat to the West. We're talking about Henry VI of England.
King of England and Duke of Normandy. This conflict is what defines Louis's foreign policy for the next 20 years.
What's the specific spark, the casus belli, that kicks it all off?
It's all about the strategic importance of Normandy, but the specific flashpoint was a single fortress, Gisors.
Gisors.
Henry I had seized Gisors, which is this incredibly strategic choke point on the Epte River. It commands the main road between Rouen, the capital of Normandy, and Paris, the capital of France.
So by taking it, Henry is putting a knife to the throat of the Isle de France.
That's a perfect way to put it. And it was also a direct violation of a previous treaty which said Gisors should either be neutral or demolished. So by fortifying it, Henry was sending a very aggressive message.
And Louis, trying to establish himself as the supreme feudal lord, demands that Henry, his vassal for Normandy, account for this.
He does. The two kings meet in person in 1109 at the Bridge of Neufel.
What was that meeting like?
It was pure political theater. Tense, highly symbolic. Henry shows up in force, displaying all his wealth and military power, and he flatly refuses to give up Gisors.
At which point Louis does something very chivalric.
Very old school. He challenges Henry I to single combat to settle the whole thing and avoid a massive war.
And Henry says no.
Of course he says no. Henry's a pragmatic, calculating ruler. He sees a duel as reckless and pointless. His refusal just highlights the difference between them. Louis is still operating in that older world of personal honor, while Henry is fighting a war of states and resources. Conflict was inevitable after that.
And in the first few years of the war, Henry uses that classic Norman strategy of trying to destabilize Louis from within.
He weaponizes the very same robber barons Louis had been fighting. And the key figure here is Theobald II, the Count of Champagne, a hugely powerful and influential lord.
Who had previously been on Louis's side against Hugh of Le Puiset.
Exactly. But now, he switches sides and joins Henry. By 1112, Theobald has put together this nasty coalition of barons who all hate Louis for his centralizing efforts. You've got Hugh of Preset again, Hugh of Crécy, a whole list of them.
So Louis is fighting a two-front war. Henry in Normandy, and an internal encirclement led by Theobald. Who does he get on his side?
Louis proves he's a clever diplomat. He exploits dissent within Normandy itself. He makes an alliance with Fulk-Vaith of Anjou, who is a powerful counterweight to Normandy, and he supports several Norman lords who hate Henry's harsh rule, like Immory de Montfort and the notorious Robert of Bellême.
But even though he manages to beat Theobald's internal coalition, he can't seem to land a knockout punch on Henry I.
He can't. The effort of putting down that domestic rebellion just exhausts his resources, and it gives Henry time to consolidate his own power in Normandy. The result is a really humiliating treaty for Louis in March 1113.
And what were the terms?
He's forced to recognize Henry VI as the suzerain of Brittany and Maine. It's basically him sanctioning a huge expansion of the Anglo-Norman sphere of influence on French soil, a major blow to his prestige.
Of course, that peace doesn't last. By 1116, they're fighting again, and this all leads up to the big one, the Battle of Bremule in 1119.
Right. Louis, maybe a bit overconfident after a few small successes, decides he wants a decisive set-piece battle.
And he gets one, and it's a disaster.
A total disaster for him. The Battle of Bremule in August 1119 was a comprehensive defeat. The Norman knights were just better. The chronicles paint this humiliating picture of Louis's troops being completely routed.
The royal banner was captured, wasn't it?
It was abandoned on the field, the ultimate symbol of his authority, just left behind. The king himself is swept up in the panic retreat. He loses everything.
So after a military defeat that crushing, he has to turn to diplomacy. He appeals to the Pope, Calixtus II.
It's a smart move. He's not just asking for a mediator. He's trying to claim the international moral high ground. He goes to the Pope and complains that Henry, his vassal, has unjustly invaded his lands and broken feudal law.
And the Pope agrees to mediate.
He does. Calixtus meets with Henry at Gisors, and they hammer out a peace treaty in 1120.
And the outcome is a mixed bag for Louis.
Very mixed. On the one hand, he gets a huge symbolic victory. Henry's heir, William Adelin, has to perform homage to Louis for the Duchy of Normandy.
Which formally recognizes the French king's superior feudal status. That's a big institutional win.
It is, and they agree to return captured lands, but...
The whole thing started over the fortress of Gisors.
And after all the fighting, all the bloodshed, all the appeals to the Pope, Louis is forced to formally concede Gisors to Henry VI. It's a bitter pill to swallow. It was a stark reminder that while Louis was the relentless fighter, Henry and I was still the richer, stronger rival on the continent. The war ended not with a bang, but with a painful concession. That rivalry with Henry Eider was draining. But the 1120s also gave Louis two critical opportunities to really define his growing power. And these weren't about winning territory. They were about projecting royal authority far beyond the Isle de France.
The first of these is his intervention in Flanders. What set that up?
A complete and utter mess, a succession crisis. In March 1127, the Count of Flanders, a man called Charles the Good, was brutally murdered.
Assassinated inside a church.
Inside the cathedral at Bruges during Mass, Flanders just explodes into chaos. You have multiple claimants all vying for powers. William of Thierry of Alsace, a guy named Arnold of Denmark. It's a vacuum.
And Louis sees this vacuum and steps in, not as a mediator, but as the supreme judge.
He moves with a speed and confidence that the Capetians had never shown before. It shows he finally feels secure enough at home to project power abroad. He marches into Flanders, declares himself the sovereign authority.
And he doesn't just pick a side. He actively enforces justice.
He hunts down the assassins. He seizes all the key towns, Ghent, Bruges, Ypres, all within weeks. It's a stunning display of military and logistical power.
And he makes sure that justice is very public.
Oh, for maximum effect. Before he leaves, Louis personally watches the execution of the murderers. They were thrown from the roof of the very church where they'd committed the crime.
A clear message.
An unambiguous message to everyone in Europe. The King of France can impose law, order, and brutal justice, even in a powerful, distant territory.
Then he makes his political move. He tries to install his own hand-picked candidate, William Clito.
This was a brilliant strategic play. William Clito was the son of Robert Curthose, the man Henry Aime had kicked out of Normandy. So for Louis, installing an anti-Henry loyalist in charge of wealthy, strategic Flanders was a masterstroke.
And at first it works. The Flemish barons elect William Clito as their new count.
A huge coup for Louis. But it was very short-lived. The whole thing fell apart almost immediately.
Why? What went wrong?
William Clito was, to put it bluntly, an incompetent ruler. And crucially, he alienated the one group you couldn't afford to alienate in Flanders. The burghers.
The townsfolk.
Yeah.
The merchants in the big cities like Ghent and Bruges.
Exactly. This is a sign of the changing nature of power in Europe. These cities were becoming incredibly wealthy and politically powerful. Clito's knights ran riot, the burghers rebelled, and they threw their support behind the other main claimant, Thierry of Alsace.
So the rising urban class rejects Louis's candidate. He tries to intervene again, but they just tell him no.
They slam the gates of Bruges in his face. He tries to use the church to excommunicate Thierry, but the political reality on the ground had shifted. When Clito dies in a siege in 1128, Louis has no choice. He has to recognize Thierry's claim.
So, on paper, it's a failure. He didn't get his guy in. Why do we still call this a defining moment for him?
Because the attempt itself redefined what the Capetian monarchy was capable of. He showed he had the will, the speed, and the power to intervene and try to dictate succession in a major European territory. Even in failure, he proved that the King of France was no longer just the local Duke of Paris, he was a major player.
Okay, so that brings us to the second big moment, the threatened imperial invasion of 1124. This is what many people see as the birth of a kind of French national identity.
It's a pivotal moment, and it's all set up by a huge stroke of luck for Louis back in 1120.
The White Ship disaster.
Exactly. Henry the Sirgar's only legitimate son and heir, William Atheling, drowns. Suddenly, Henry's dynasty is in crisis, and that gives Louis a massive, unexpected advantage in their rivalry.
So Henry I, feeling vulnerable, needs a big deterrent. He calls in the big guns.
He calls in his son-in-law, Henry V, the Holy Roman Emperor, and persuades him to invade France from the east.
And the emperor has his own reasons for agreeing.
He does. He's married to Henry I's daughter, Matilda. He has ambitions in the Low Countries, so supporting his father-in-law by attacking France makes perfect strategic sense for him.
So you have the Holy Roman Emperor, one of the most powerful rulers in Christendom, assembling a massive German army to march on Reims. This is a true existential threat.
It should have been the end for Louis. A king who had just barely gotten control of his own backyard is now facing one of Europe's superpowers. But this is the aha moment of his entire reign. This is where all that tedious fighting against robber barons pays off.
Because the German army never arrives.
It assembles, it prepares to march, and it just stops.
But let's stop this.
Louis VI's appeal. It was a masterpiece of political and national rhetoric. Because he had spent 2 decades establishing himself as the protector of the realm, the French baronsmen who fought him constantly, they all rose up in astonishing unity to face the foreign threat.
He accidentally created a unified front.
And he wrapped it in brilliant spiritual packaging. He goes to the Abbey of Saint-Denis, the patron saint of Paris and the French crown, and he declares himself the vassal of Saint-Denis. He takes up the oriflamme, the sacred red battle banner of the abbey.
So he turns a feudal conflict into a holy national defense.
Precisely.
Yeah.
He's no longer just defending his lands, he's defending France under the banner of its patron saint. And Henry V looks across the border and sees not a fragmented kingdom ripe for the picking, but a fully mobilized, unified French army. He realized the price of invasion was suddenly far too high, and he abandoned the whole campaign.
So Louis wins without a single battle. He deters the emperor politically.
This is a foundational moment. It gives real credibility to the idea of a collective French identity, with the king at its center as the divinely appointed protector. Even if our source, Sugar, exaggerated how unified they all were, the fact remains. The coalition formed and the emperor retreated. Louis had turned the theoretical power of his crown into a tangible military deterrent on the world stage.
So by the time Louis reaches his final years, his endless fighting has finally started to pay off. The kingdom is more or less secure, and the political winds are finally blowing his way.
Externally, the pressure just vanished. Henry VI of England dies in December 1135, and England immediately descends into a brutal civil war, the period we call the Anarchy, as Stephen of Blois usurps the throne from Henry's daughter Matilda.
So the Anglo-Norman war machine turns on itself.
It's completely tied up. It gives Louis this invaluable window of peace to consolidate his power.
And at home, his old rivals have finally fallen into line.
Yes, he's no longer chasing brigands from castle to castle. Even his most formidable opponent, Theobald of Champagne, has finally rallied to the Capetian cause. He recognizes Louis as the undisputed supreme authority in the realm. Louis has truly made the transition from fighter to sovereign.
But the real masterstroke, the grand finale of his entire reign, is the acquisition of Aquitaine.
Pure opportunistic genius. In April 1137, William X, the powerful Duke of Aquitaine, dies suddenly while on a pilgrimage. And on his deathbed, he makes a decision that changes the map of Europe. He appoints his feudal overlord, Louis VI, as the guardian of his only heir.
His 15-year-old daughter, Eleanor of Aquitaine.
Suddenly, this teenage girl controls a massive, wealthy territory that is far larger and richer than the entire Capetian royal domain. She is instantly the most eligible heiress in Europe.
And Louis VI, even though he's old and sick, understands the stakes immediately.
He acts with the same speed he used in Flanders. He immediately arranges for Eleanor to marry his own son and heir, the future Louis VII. And considering the logistics of the time, he gets it done with incredible speed. The wedding takes place just 3 months later on July 25, 1137 in Bordeaux.
At a stroke, he has added the single greatest duchy in France to the Capetian domain. It's an unbelievable territorial game, and he did it with a marriage contract, not a sword.
It's a culmination of his life's work, the validation of his entire 29-year project of centralizing and expanding royal power.
And then comes this staggering historical irony. How long does Louis VI, the man who sought so hard for so long, get to enjoy his ultimate triumph?
7 days.
1 week.
He died of dysentery in Paris on August 1st, 1137. He lived just long enough to see the marriage contract signed and the wedding completed, and then he was gone.
Which brings us to the final, painful irony of his reign. He spends his life in this brutal stalemate with Henry II over little fortresses like Gisors, and then wins this massive prize in Aquitaine. But the sources show that the seeds of the next great conflict, the Angevin Empire that would dominate his son's reign, were actually planted by Henry VI years earlier.
That's the beautiful, terrible subtlety of high politics. The greatest threat to the Capetian future wasn't forged on the battlefield of Bremule. It was forged in 1128 when Henry VI, desperate for an heir after the White Ship disaster, married his only surviving legitimate child, Matilda.
To Geoffrey Plantagenet, the Count of Anjou.
Exactly, and the son of that marriage would be Henry II of England.
Who would inherit England from his mother's side, Normandy from his mother's side, and Anjou from his father.
Creating this gargantuan power block, the Angevin Empire, that would dwarf the Capetian lands. Louis VI brilliantly secured Aquitaine, but his great rival, years earlier, had already set in motion the political marriage that would create an almost insurmountable obstacle for the next generation of French kings. So when you look back, if you synthesize Louis VI's reign, what you really see is the blueprint for the future French monarchy. He stabilized the Ile-de-France through sheer grinding force. He established the crown's jurisdiction.
He survived Henry VI, and he unified the nation, or at least the idea of a nation, against Henry V.
And then his final brilliant act, strategically securing Aquitaine. He leaves his son, Louis VII, a monarchy that is significantly more powerful, but also, as we've seen, deeply challenged.
He really wasn't a grand battlefield commander, and his body failed him in his later years. But his output, his energy was just relentless. He was a political and military force in constant motion. He really proved that the fighter mentality wasn't just about winning wars.
It was about institutionalizing authority.
He established that the king was the necessary protector, the source of justice. He laid all the groundwork that his grandson, Philip Augustus, would later use to finally break up that massive Angevin empire Henry had started to build.
His legacy is one of foundational work. He was the king who, through constant struggle, made the Capetian crown indispensable to the life of France.
And that leads us to our final provocative thought for you, the listener, to think about. Louis VI's life was a study in these contrasts. Physical weakness that masked incredible political strength, endless small-scale conflicts aimed at huge strategic games. But think about this. While he secured his greatest victory, Aquitaine, through a rapid strategic marriage, the sources suggest that the seeds of the greatest future conflict, the Angevin Empire, were sown by his rival, Henry VI, through the much quieter, seemingly minor dynastic marriage of Matilda and Geoffrey Plantagenet.
So how often are the greatest, most consequential shifts in history determined not by the grand, noisy battles that we all remember,
but by those carefully calculated, seemingly quiet, but utterly binding dynastic marriage arrangements?
A powerful reminder that sometimes the pen, or in this case, the marriage contract, is strategically mightier than the sword, even for le batailleur.
Thank you for joining us for the deep dive. We'll see you next time.